The totalitarian state. Finally, technique causes the state to become totalitarian, to absorb the citizen's life completely. We have noted that this occurs as a result of the accumulation of techniques in the hands of the state. Techniques are mutually engendered and hence interconnected, forming a system that tightly encloses all our activities. When the state takes hold of a single thread of this network of techniques, little by little it draws to itself all the matter and the method, whether or not it consciously wills to do so. Even when the state is resolutely liberal and democratic, it cannot do otherwise than become totalitarian. It becomes so either directly or, as in the United States, through intermediate persons. But despite differences, all such systems come ultimately to the same result. I shall not repeat these facts, since I believe that I have sufficiently emphasized them. Technique engenders totalitarianism by another expedient, its mode of action. Let us take, for example, that of total war. There has been a theory of total war, and consequently, it would seem, some will and choice in the matter. But the action of techniques nowadays makes war of necessity total. But the action of techniques nowadays makes war of necessity total. The use of guided missiles such as the V-2 weapons and rockets, which had an error of about 9 miles in 300... And rockets which had an error of about 9 miles in 300 miles? Presuppose that the great majority of them would fall among the civilian population. The same holds for the intercontinental ballistic missile. One ICBM is capable of destroying all life over very considerable areas. Automatic steering mechanisms can give great precision to the flight of anti-aircraft missiles. But precision of aim has no meaning when targets are terrestrial objects closely grouped together. A formation of bombers is isolated in the sky, and a missile fired at them necessarily hits a military target. But this is not so on the ground. The situation is even more acute with an H-bomb, which can destroy everything within a radius of 30 miles. Despite any and all possible precautions, the H-bomb would destroy civilians and non-military structures. There is no need here to decide whether or not to make total war. Even if one wished to limit it, war is total because the means are totalitarian. The same applies to civilian techniques. It is no longer possible to limit their effects even if there is a desire to do so. Censoring films may sometimes limit their subject matter, give them a conformist tone or a moral content. But it does not touch the essential, that is, the psychic modification of the individual by means of violent impression films make upon him. Okay, I'm going to read that again. The same applies to civilian techniques. It is no longer possible to limit their effects even if there is a desire to do so. Censoring films may sometimes limit their subject matter, give them a conformist tone or a moral content, but it does not touch the essential, that is, the psychic modification of the individual by means of the violent impressions films make upon him. The emotion he inevitably feels modifies the psychological tonus of the individual and tends to make him a component of a mob. Such effects lie outside the range of possible means of rectification. Or, put more precisely, new means of rectification will be invented. One might, for example, try psychoanalysis, or one might limit the number of performances each week. But such measures only represent a new attack on the human soul or a new limitation of freedom. It would be possible to consider in turn every element of state technique and to show that each one, pushed to the limit, leads to totalitarianism. Jacques Driencourt has unwittingly done this for propaganda, and Ernst Kahn Bramstedt for police techniques. Driencourt attempts to show that propaganda is consistent with democracy, but he recognizes parenthetically that democratic government is obliged to integrate propaganda into its institutions for reasons outside its own principles. He recognizes that democracy is obliged to exploit the same practices, the same violations of human conscience, and the same encouragement of conformism as does totalitarianism. He has, in fact, shown that propaganda is in itself totalitarian. And when he asserts that propaganda is democratic, if it is not a monopoly, he forgets what he proved at the beginning of his book, that propaganda always tends to monopoly. The fact is that when the state employs a complete and technical propaganda system, it inevitably becomes totalitarian. Driencourt notes with surprise that the country which boasts of being most liberal, that is, the United States, is the country in which the technique of thought direction is, by its perfection, the closest to totalitarian practices, and is the country in which people, accustomed to living in groups, are most inclined to leave it to the experts to fix lines of spiritual conduct. I'll blow my nose. Hey, baby. Hey, little baby. Where's a good boy? Hey. I love you. I love you, baby. Are you happy? You want some food? What do you need? Okay. Hi, babe. You okay? What you doing, buddy? Hey, come here. Come here. Hey. Good boy. Oh, you want to cuddle? He's a good boy. Oh, you want to bite me? Hey, you got some stuff in your eye. Let me get that. Let me get that. I got it. I got it. You sleep. Good boy. Good boy. Thought you were gonna jump out of my lap. Usually jump out of my lap. What you doing? Who the fuck is muting? What is this shit? What is this shit? There you go. I have a like. Where do I look? Comments. Live chat. Nothing. Okay. So the United States is a totalitarian shithole. Damn. Wait a minute. Have you been biting on my book, you son of a bitch? Is that just from walking on it? Looks like you've been scratching on it. Okay. As for the police power, it is to be noted that when it becomes technical, it assumes the leading position in the state and becomes a fundamental institution, not merely a supplementary one. It affirms itself as the essence of the state. It appears as a mysterious entity which evades all laws and assumes complete autonomy. This is the police power. As Hamel says, It is the irrational nucleus which escapes all definition and limitation by the sovereignty of the state. In fact, we might as well have undisguised totalitarianism, which controls everything, since the simple use of techniques produces a totalitarian structure of the state, as it does in the economy. Why is this so? The answer is that technique is a mass instrument. One can think of technique only in terms of categories. Technique has no place for the individual. The personal means nothing to it. We certainly cannot deny in theory that every individual is particular. We even concede him his particularity willingly. But in the case of rules of organization and action, we are unable to take this particularity into account. It must remain carefully concealed. The particular is identical with the subjective and is not allowed to show. If it could appear, it would have to do so by way of technique. And in technique, there is no particular. Technical procedures, therefore, abstract from the individual and seek traits common to masses of men and mass phenomena. Without these common traits, neither statistics nor the use of law of great numbers, nor the Gaussian curve, indeed, no organization, would be possible. Abstraction from the individual is doubtless intended only as a formal procedure for the convenience of reasoning. But the formal has become terribly real. It has produced the world which constrains man on every side, which leaves him no outlet to that realm which was ostensibly excluded merely for the convenience of reasoning. There no longer exists any form in which the particular can be concretely incarnated because form has become the domain of technique. Technique, in the form of psychotechnique, aspires to take over the individual, that is, to transform the qualitative into the quantitative. It knows only two possible solutions: the transformation or the annihilation of the qualitative. It is precisely by the way of the former that technique is totalitarian, and when the state becomes technical, it too becomes totalitarian. It has no alternative. What is the word? Qualitative. That would mean like quantitative would be to put it in numbers. Qualitative. Qualitative is related to measuring with the quality of something rather than its quantity of high quality. Qualitative research relies on data obtained by researcher from first-hand observation, interviews, questionnaires. It transforms the qualitative into the quantitative. Oh, so it makes quality a numerical value. It takes the quality of human life and puts a number on it. I think that's what he's saying. I'm not a number. I'm a free man. Hey, what's up, Bond? Gavin tries to get me, he keeps telling me to email Praise and ask Praise to unban me from his Discord or some shit. And I'm just like, he's just gonna fucking ban me again. Like, Praise is a dipshit, man. I haven't really been paying attention to YouTube, but last I seen it was like, what, Praise, Smokey, and who is it, Ryan? They've got like a trinity of hate or something. Fucking hate Christians. Okay. The words totalitarian state inevitably evoke cliches and passionate opinions. But these no longer represent anything but historical reminiscences. The totalitarian state we are discussing here is not the brutal, immoderate thing which tortured, deformed, and broke everything in its path, the battleground of armed bullies and factions, a place of dungeons and the reign of the arbitrary. These things did certainly exist, but they represented transient traits, not real characteristics of the totalitarian state. It might even be said that they were the human aspects of the state in its inhumanity. Torture and excess are the acts of persons who use them as a means of releasing a suppressed need for power. This does not interest us here. It does not represent the true face of the completely technical totalitarian state. In such a state, nothing useless exists. There is no torture. Torture is a wasteful expenditure of psychic energy which destroys salvageable resources without producing useful results. There is no systemically organized famine, but rather a recognition of the pressing necessity of maintaining the labor force in good condition. There is nothing arbitrary, for the arbitrary represents the very opposite of technique, in which everything has a reason, not a final but a mechanical reason. Irrationality might appear to exist, but only for the person who knows nothing of technique. It is like trying to tell a man who does not know that that there is music all around him, although he cannot hear it. So if you don't understand technique, you might think that the states are acting irrationally. And then to try and tell them that they're not being irrational is like to tell a man who doesn't know anything about radio that there's invisible invisible light waves or not electromagnetic waves all around us that contain music that we can't hear unless we have a tuner. The totalitarian state does not necessarily have totalitarian theories, nor does it necessarily even desire them. On the contrary, what we call totalitarian doctrines litter up the clear line of the technical state with aberrant elements such as race, blood, proletariat. The technical state is the technical state only because it exploits certain technical means. There is, however, a great difference between the democracies and the so-called totalitarian states. All are following the same road, but dictatorial states have become conscious of the possibilities of exploiting technique. They know and consciously desire whatever advantage can be drawn from it. The rule, for them, is to use means without limitation of any sort. The democratic states, on the other hand, have not attained to this consciousness and are consequently inhibited in their development. Scruples concerning tradition, principles, judicial affirmations, the maintenance of a facade of public and private morality, all these still exist in the democratic state. It may be going too far to say that scruples concerning human beings also exist in democratic states. The democratic state is preoccupied most of all with a very special type of man, the voter. All these scruples, in any case, are without force or reality. They are merely verbal smokescreens, and the democracies disregard them every time it is necessary to do so. This facade no longer corresponds in any way to a real community. It represents only vestiges of a community. Nevertheless, however without substance, such talk may be, it still has great importance in democratic life, especially as it acts to prevent democratic governments from launching themselves along the road of technique without some other justification. Here, more than anywhere else, justification is necessary. Even so, democracies have a bad governmental conscience which no one has succeeded in dispelling. The state has not taken the decisive step of affirming that only technical necessity counts. It has therefore failed to do two things: to become conscious of what the state can accomplish by exploiting techniques, and to sow its wild oats by deciding that there are no compelling moral reasons to get in its way. Thus, at present, every time the democratic state exploits a given technique, it must begin all over again to justify itself, to debate the necessity of the proposed measure, and to question everything. In the long run, it will have to capitulate, but in the meantime, its scruples act as a drag on it, if not the actual application of techniques, which would, in any case, be impossible, at least in its enterprise. In order to force the democratic state to come to any decision, there must always be a present danger, some direct competition with the dictatorial state, in which action becomes a matter of life or death. The superiority of dictatorship stems wholly from its massive exploitation of techniques. Democracy has no choice in the matter. Either it utilizes techniques in the same way as the enemy, or it will perish. It is clear enough that the first term of this proposition will prevail. For this reason, wars always bring about a prodigious advance in the use of certain techniques in democratic societies. The democracies are, of course, careful to assert that they are using these techniques only because of the state of war. But there are always wars of one kind or another: war preparations, Cold War, Hot War, New Cold War, and so on ad infinitum. Okay, what did we just get out of war with? The invisible enemy. The war on the coronavirus transformed our democracy. It used techniques. Yes. So the coronavirus, the pandemic, was the justification for the use of new techniques, right? We're at war with the invisible enemy, according to Trump. It's all said right here. Indeed, Cold War is as productive as Hot War in forcing the democracies to imitate the dictatorships in the use of technique. Remember what they said during the pandemic. The CDC praised China because the Chinese government, due to the fact that it's totalitarian, authoritarian, it could impose techniques upon its population that the free democratic Western nations could not. And thus, the Chinese system was more efficient at eliminating or protecting its population from the coronavirus. So, the whole point of the pandemic was to get us to act more like China, as he's saying right here. Indeed, Cold War is as productive as Hot War in forcing the democracies to imitate the dictatorships in the use of technique. Right there. What happened? CDC praises China for its response to the pandemic. The officers of the French army, for example, have been obliged to engage in psychological activity and subversive war to counter the enemy's use of these. Here's a good example of technical imitation of a dictatorship by a democracy. Up to this point, we have contrasted the democratic state with the dictatorial state, but we have not distinguished among the different forms assumed by the dictatorships. There are two major lines followed by these states, represented respectively by communism and fascism. The question might be put whether or not these two are identical. A superficial bourgeois survey will immediately come up with an affirmative answer on the basis of certain massive facts of the present day. It might be noted, for example, that both sides have concentration camps, enormous police apparatus, torture, ration cards, economic and other kinds of planning, plebiscites in place of elections, a single party, Nazi or communist, dominating the state, a single individual exercising plenary powers, and so on. Plenary powers. This adds up to a complex of identical forms. As a consequence, the regimes are alike. The intellectuals, however, will protest against such a hasty assimilation of the two, and in a deeper sense, the differences are real. In communism, despite its methods, there is an indubitable will to human liberation. It has the genuine support of millions of poverty-stricken persons, and consequently, a humane aspect which fascism never possessed. It recruits its adherents from many different parties, on the one hand from the true proletariat, and on the other from the lumpen proletariat, that is to say, a sub-proletariat without positive value. Communism has the honesty not to affirm bogus spiritual values or make pacts with international capitalism. In addition, the fact that Nazism was anti-Semitic has a special significance for Christians, a point which Karl Barth has emphasized. Communism as such does not imply this, even though it may become anti-Semitic for short periods. Upon closer analysis, however, we find a similarity between the two, a comparable attitude toward techniques. This relation may appear to some a bit thin, but it is the very essence of the twin movement represented by communism and fascism, both of which owe their origin to techniques, and uniquely so. Communism emerges when the development of certain techniques endangers the very society which has allowed them to flourish. Communist dialectic makes its appearance as an explanation of the way in which technical progress first produced a society, then transcended that society's economic and political forms, finally provoking their inevitable decline. Marxism orders this succession of events into a precise doctrine. It furnishes the key to an understanding of the modern world and at the same time ties its own fate to that of technique. Recall in this connection the famous remark of Lenin concerning socialism and electrification. Marxism is, in fact, nothing but an epiphenomenon of technical development, a phase of the painful marriage of man and technique. Neither with thee nor without thee. It is an attempt at dialectic reconciliation, so to speak. Fascism stands in exactly the same relation to technique. It can be stated without exaggeration, in spite of the scandalous character of such an affirmation, that both fascism and Nazism are approximations derived from Marx for the adaptation of man to his techniques. They represent that part of Marxism which is centered on the narrower problem of the state and technique, whereas Marxism itself is a broader theory encompassing the totality of the problem of society and technique. Nazism, however, far from being opposed to Marxism, completes it and confirms it. It gives solution to numerous problems of adaptation. Hitler's methods stem directly from Lenin's precepts, and conversely, Stalinism learned certain lessons about technique from the Nazis. If we suppress the episodic in order to get at the essential, we find in the two fraternal enemies the same phenomena of awe at the power to be had from technique, and the same enthusiastic pursuit of the same objective. The Guelphs and the Ghibellines made merciless war on each other to decide which party was to exercise world supremacy, but they had the same objective, the greatest possible power of the state, whose sovereignty had no limits, the earthly hope of all whom feudal anarchy had exhausted. The dictatorial state has efficiency as its goal. It submits to the law of techniques, for it understands that only by giving techniques free rein can it hope to derive the maximum profit from them. Whatever techniques are involved, human or physical, economic or educational, the state musters around it all. Whatever techniques are involved, human or physical, economic or educational, the state musters around it all available technical instruments. This occurs spontaneously, by chance, but in dictatorial states it is voluntarily calculated, studied, and therefore the process occurs more rapidly. It is the end sought by all forms of state. The communist knows that the technical progress means the progress of the proletariat. The Nazi knows that he is the instrument of state power. He cannot conceive that anyone would allow its limitation. Nazism gave its goals an ideological veneer, but this veneer was futile insofar as it was not an instrument of propaganda and proceeded too rapidly. Communism, in its fusion of technique and state, proved much more prudent in that the sense more humanistic. It was in this way closer to reality and less shocking to the conscience of the average man. Hitlerism caused the essential barbarism of the thing to explode in men's faces. Behemoth showed his true face, and it proved to be too terrifying for the man of 1930, who still sought to hold on to some of his illusions and to preserve for himself at least the semblance of freedom. In this, Nazism committed a grave error which communists knew well enough how to exploit. However, both Nazism and communism were working toward the total exploitation of the means which man had created to vanquish necessity. Nazism gave its goals an ideological veneer, but this veneer was futile insofar as it was not an instrument of propaganda and proceeded too rapidly. So the Nazi ideology was not an instrument of propaganda and proceeded too rapidly. Communism, in its fusion of technique and state, proved much more prudent in that sense more humanistic. In this way it was closer to reality and less shocking to conscience of the average man. Hitlerism caused the essential barbarism of the thing to explode in men's faces. Oh, so Hitler was... Behemoth showed his true face, and it proved to be too terrifying for the man of 1930, who still sought to hold on to some illusions. Oh, Hitler was more like openly technical and didn't like try to pretend. Hitler did not create this illusion of freedom that communism. So yeah. How long have I been streaming? Half hour. I'm gonna go work out. Peace.